Good morning and welcome to this Total Education Centre lecture brought to you by Total Education Media on Blade Runner. Today I want to talk about pretext, a little bit about pretext and a little bit about the context. And it's very important that you understand this prior to watching the film, because when we watch the film I need you to watch it with a sense of purpose, because it's no use just watching it and letting it flow over you, although that's probably the best way to watch it for the first time and become involved in the story. But more importantly, we need to look at it as a textual study, and we need to study for a purpose. So it's not like we're going to the movies to enjoy ourselves in many ways, although the film is exceptionally enjoyable. So let's have a think about Blade Runner. It's a Ridley Scott film, and Ridley Scott, of course, is an extremely famous director, producer, media personality really, who's won several Academy Awards. Blade Runner is one of his finest films, there's no doubt about that, and Blade Runner sort of set a trend in this sort of film noir, science fiction, gothic-y thing. And certainly if you watch the director's cut, which you are studying, it is a far better version of the film than the studio production that was released earlier, which was a sort of, I don't know, disconnected piece that Ridley Scott really sort of rejected after he'd finished it. He gets excellent performances out of all the actors, and part of that, without going into his biography too much, and we really don't need to look at that biography in great detail because it has no great direct relevance to the film, is that he was an advertising producer prior to making films. And so that the sequencing and the cutting and all those sorts of things that are so effective in Blade Runner, he learnt that trade very early, and he did hundreds of TV commercials. So he was very experienced in dealing with it, with that sort of film work and cutting and moving and producing a tone and producing a visual delight, if you like, in a very short space of time. Whereas Blade Runner is exactly the same feel over a longer period of time, and certainly he was very successful in what he did, and Blade Runner is certainly one of the highly regarded films of all time, as it should be. It certainly was, even prior to this, a cult success, and people watch it and watch it and watch it again. And if you get on the internet, you can find all sorts of things about Blade Runner. Don't be involved in that too heavily. Some of it's very odd and very strange and will certainly lead you astray. But you can see the depth of passion that people feel about the movie and what it represents. So certainly if I say to you that we need to look at what we're studying this film for and what's our sense of purpose in watching it, really we're looking in this study about what it is to be human, or what is humanity. And I think he explores that question very deeply in the film through both the replicants and the real, in inverted commas, people that we see in the film. I should clear up any misapprehensions before we begin our study as well, that Deckard is a replicant. Ridley Scott, in an interview with the BBC, said he was a replicant, and I think that would be enough for us. You'll find much debate on the internet prior to that about, is Deckard a replicant, is he not a replicant, and does it matter? The question has been solved by Ridley Scott himself, who I think got sick of reading all the gossip about it. So let's now have a look at context and where we should be approaching the film from. So what is the context of Blade Runner? Well, certainly it's a 1982 film, so its socio-historical context stems from that period in time and a little bit probably prior to that. So what do we see in the world? What's happening in 1982 that makes it so important? Now obviously in the short space of time that I have here, I can't go into any great detail about these things, and probably should be looking and listening to the more detailed lectures that are available on the website, and certainly reading the notes that are associated with those, which go into great detail. But I can give you a brief overview here to get you started in your studies. Global warming was still important in the 1980s as much as it is now, and it probably wasn't called global warming then, but there were certainly definite concerns about the environment and the way the weather's changing. And certainly if we, and I'll draw one parallel to the film here where you see the constant rain and the darkness falling, and that's a sign of a fear of the environmental degradation that was occurring even as early back in the 1980s. Certainly in that period of time, another great fear was deforestation, and that there was the idea of acid rain, and again the link to the film with the rain falling constantly, that would eat away the trees, and all just the general lack of environmental care was a really major concern in that 1980s period, and many people did think, as Ridley Scott portrays in the film, that the world would end like that very quickly. Now, a point on that, in 1982, 2019 was a long way away. Certainly now, as we watch the film, it's not. But remember, this is a science fiction film. Certainly, you need to use your imagination, and the date at the start could be any time, anywhere in the future, really. And you don't have to stick to that 2019 as a prediction. What else were we worried about in 1982 environmentally? Well, the decline of fossil fuels, and we can see that in the film as well with the cars flying in the air. We're not using fossil fuels necessarily, we're using other forms of movement and power sources, so that's important. What else do we have in 1982? Well, we see social inequity, the haves and the have-nots, and that is very clear in this film. We notice that Tyrell lives in the giant pyramidal type structure. He's isolated from the world, and the rich have sort of moved away, and what's left on earth are the extremely poor or the very, very rich who can isolate themselves and maintain a preserve around themselves, in fact, and that's very important. So remember the haves and the have-nots, and in those days it was called the first world versus the third world, and now we call it the developed versus the developing world, and the differences in those. And if you look at those terms and find those terms, you'll understand where Ridley Scott was coming from when he created the world of Blade Runner, if you like. Certainly in the 1980s, that the idea of that developing nations, and even in our own developed nations as we call them now, there's that underclass of people, the poor, the very poor, and how that poverty is spreading widely throughout society. And I know that we've made some claims to counter that at the moment, but it hasn't worked, and we see underclasses still existing in our own society, and certainly in that world the underclasses are there, and we see the decay in the buildings, the old Gothic style buildings where J.F. Sebastian lives, and how that's sort of been broken down, and the structures are falling apart, and nothing works very well. What else do we have in the 1980s? Well, we certainly have a huge focus on consumerism, and that consumerism, I mean, obviously you understand what consumerism is, sorry, pardon me, and what consumerism does, but that sense of owning stuff, and that's seen here very clearly in all the advertising. And consumerism is really about greed and what happens, and what Ridley Scott shows us in the world of Blade Runner is that greed has exacerbated itself, and what it's done is it's consumed and used all the resources on Earth, and there's really nothing left on Earth that's useful. All nature seems to have been destroyed, and now man has to create his own nature to make sure that the world exists in a way that's acceptable to him, and I'll talk more about that in another lecture. What else? Consumerism is about materialism. Materialism is about greed, and greed at the expense of, sorry, again, our ethics and emotions and the things that are important, and there's some of the values that come across, and of course we need to link those values later on, and I'll talk about those in detail, and you can find those in the notes. Sorry. The socio-historical context also comes from a movie called Wall Street, where the phrase was greed is good, and I think you'll find that where greed is good, we have that sense of overdevelopment and overproduction and consumerism to its greatest extent, and I think that's what Blade Runner shows very clearly. What else is important in 1982? A sense of, pardon me, a sense of personal fulfillment, the focus on the individual, the search for personal happiness is important in the 80s, and I think if we look at Blade Runner as a fact, what is important in Blade Runner is that the search for personal happiness comes not necessarily from the humans on the planet, but from the replicants. I mean, Roy's main focus and main drive is to keep himself and the people that he associates with alive and happy. And the notion of rights was very important in the 80s too, where people understood, certainly better in those days than perhaps they do now, the sense of responsibility, but everyone was just starting to focus on what rights they had and the rights of people who'd been disenfranchised for a long time. And in this case, the replicants are the ones who are the disenfranchised. And in fact, their lives are predicated in a time frame that's very, very short. And that's so important to remember, that their rights have been subsumed, and yet they are more human than human, as Tyrell's phrase would suggest. What else could there be in the film that we look at and we see as important? And one of the things that comes from the 80s and that period is the domination of the males-dominated society. And this film has been called misogynist in some ways, and that's not an issue we really want to tackle in our study. There's plenty on it, but perhaps we should be more focused on the awareness of inequity. And it is, the female roles in this film are sort of, in many ways, minor. You could say Rachel is an important love interest, but a minor figure. And the other two women, one's a stripper in a bar and the other one's a pleasure model. So you can sort of see where that has evolved, and that comes directly out of the 80s, where it was a very male-dominated society. And Ridley Scott's just extrapolated that. Whether you can talk about the film in other terms is really irrelevant to our study, and I don't want you to get focused on that at all. So what is it? What has Ridley Scott created from that context? He's created a world of obvious past excesses, consumerism and exploitation. And we see that in the mass advertising that's been around and all the problems that occur with that in that world, the neon signs, the lighting and all that sort of stuff. He's created a world of environmental degradation where there is no nature, only man-made nature. A world of neglect where everything's falling apart, and the main secret of life really is to get off-world, and we see advertising for that, and everybody wants to be off-world, and the reason off-world's so successful is the replicants have really made it that way, haven't they? We see people fleeing their world, and we still have now people talking about moving off into space. I don't think that idea is too far-fetched in many ways, especially when it's considered from back in that context of the 1980s, where people were thinking about what can we do. They also shows a lack of emotion. Nobody smiles. It's soulless and removed. If you look at the scenes on the street, everybody's sort of individual. No one's happy, no one's smiling, everyone's just moving forward. And it's all broken down, and communication seems broken down. And I think that's a world that came straight from the 1980s. We also have the dominance of science and technology. We see Tyrell's corporation dominating the world, and he's making everything. He's even making the people. He's making everything that matters, really. And hope for the world has sort of been taken away by technology and science, and that lack of ethics and spirituality, which I think is really important. And I think that's one of the focuses that Ridley Scott has, and one of the values that you'll see come across in the film, is that lack of spirituality. And we see materialism as a very negative replacement for that sense of spirituality. Well, that gives us a little bit of an overview of the film before we watch it, and how we should view it and how we should understand it. And we need to look at that in a sense of, okay, so there's some ideas that are in the film. Let's get that purpose sorted out very clearly. Let's watch it with those things in mind, and we'll relate it back to that main issue, what it means to be human. Thank you for watching this Total Education lecture, brought to you by Total Education Media. My name's Bruce Pattinson. Don't forget to visit the website. You can purchase lectures on that website. Don't forget to like us on the button down below. Subscribe and keep watching our channel for more free videos. Thank you.